Hi there, I'm Emily Muhlstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video for Coastal Migratory Pelagic Amendment 26, and it addresses king mackerel issues. In 2014, a king mackerel stock assessment was completed, and it showed that king mackerel is neither overfished nor experiencing overfishing. It also revised the mixing zone for the migratory groups of king mackerel, and it also revised the acceptable biological catch levels. In addition to dealing with those things, the Gulf Council is considering reallocating quota for commercial zones and also between sectors, and the South Atlantic Council is considering bag limit sales of king mackerel for the shark gillnet fishery. So there are a number of different management actions in this document. I suggest, since it's going to take me a while to go through each one, that if you're Gulf Council specific or South Atlantic specific, or if there's just one issue you're looking for, that you skip ahead in the video to the actions that interest you. We'll start with Action 1 that deals with the king mackerel stock boundary. So currently, from April 1st through October 31st, the stock boundary between the Gulf and South Atlantic is at the Collier-Monroe County line. That shifts, and November 1st through March 31st, the stock boundary is at the Flagler-Volusia County line. The most recent stock assessment suggested that a smaller mixing zone exists for king mackerel. For Action 1, the first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would leave the stock boundary just as it is. Alternative 2 would establish a single year-round boundary on the western edge of the mixing zone, and it would delegate management to the South Atlantic Council. Alternative 3 is the current preferred alternative, and that would establish a single year-round boundary on the eastern edge of that newly defined mixing zone and delegate management of that area to the Gulf Council. Action 2 addresses Atlantic catch limits. The South Atlantic Council's scientific advisors reviewed the latest stock assessment and have recommended new acceptable biological catch levels. That allows the Council to consider revising their annual catch limits and annual catch targets. We'll start with the South Atlantic acceptable biological catch. Currently, that is set at 10.46 million pounds. The newly recommended Atlantic acceptable biological catch limits are shown in this table below. Now you'll notice that there are variable recruitment levels, and there's an option here of either high, medium, or low. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would leave the acceptable biological catch at its current level. The second alternative is the Council's preferred alternative, and that would revise the acceptable biological catch for 2016 through 2020 based on high recruitment scenario. Alternative 3 would revise that ABC for 2016 through 2020 based on the medium recruitment scenario. Or Alternative 4 would revise the ABC for 2016 through 2020 based on the low recruitment scenario. Let's move on to the South Atlantic annual catch limits and annual catch targets. So the South Atlantic annual catch limit is set equal to the acceptable biological catch level. The recreational annual catch target is either set at 50% of the annual catch limit or at the annual catch limit times 1 minus the percent standard error. The first alternative is the no action alternative. That would leave the ACLs and ACTs at their current levels. The second alternative would revise the annual catch limits and annual catch targets based on the acceptable biological catch levels that are selected in Action 2.1. Alternative 3 is the Council's current preferred alternative, and that would establish a constant catch annual catch limit at 12.7 million pounds for the years of 2016 through 2020. Alternative 4 would establish a constant catch annual catch limit of 11.6 million pounds for the years 2016 through 2020. And finally, Action 5 would revise the ACL and the ACT based on 90% of the acceptable biological catch level that is selected in Action 2.1. Action 3 addresses the sale of king mackerel in the shark gillnet fishery. So the bag limit sale of king mackerel was prohibited in 2014. Drift gill nets are not authorized gear for king mackerel, meaning that fish caught in that gear cannot be sold. The South Atlantic Council is considering allowing fishermen that are in that small coastal shark gillnet fishery to sell the bag limit of king mackerel. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative. Alternative 2 would allow the retention and sale of Atlantic king mackerel that's caught incidentally in that gillnet fishery, as long as the boats have both a federal king mackerel permit and a shark commercial permit. In the federal waters off the state of Florida, there would be a 2 fish per person bag limit, and north of the Florida-Georgia line, there would be a 3 fish per person bag limit. Alternative 3 is the Council's current preferred alternative. That would also allow the retention and sale of Atlantic king mackerel that are caught in that gillnet fishery for boats that have both the federal king mackerel permit and the shark commercial permit. In the southern zone, the bag limit would be 2 fish per person, and in the northern zone, the bag limit would be 3 fish per person. Action 4 addresses a South Atlantic southern zone split season. Right now, the commercial fishing year for the South Atlantic starts on March 1st and ends at the end of February the following year. Partitioning the quota in the Atlantic southern zone into 2 fishing seasons may increase fishing opportunities. The 2 councils have different preferred alternatives for this action. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that's the current Gulf Council's preferred alternative. The South Atlantic's preferred alternative is Alternative 2, which would allocate the Atlantic Southern Zone quota into 2 split seasons. 60% of that quota would go to the first season, which opens March 1st and would remain open through September 30th. And then 40% of the quota would go to the second season, which opens October 1st and goes through the end of February. Alternative 3 would allocate the Atlantic Southern Zone quota into 2 split seasons as well. The difference here is that the first season, which would get 60% of that quota, would open March 1st and close on October 31st. And then the second season would get 40%, and that would open November 1st and remain open through the end of February. And then the final alternative is Alternative 4, and that would allocate the Atlantic Southern Zone quota into 2 split seasons. 50% of the quota would go to the first season, which would open March 1st and remain open through October 31st. And then 50% of the quota would go to the second season, which would open November 1st and remain open through the end of February. For all of these alternatives, if there's any remaining quota left over from the first season, that quota would go into the second season. However, if there is quota remaining for the second season, that would not carry over because that signifies the end of the fishing year. Action 5 addresses the southern zone trip limit in the South Atlantic. From April 1st through October 31st, north of the Flagler-Brevard County line, the trip limit is 3,500 pounds. South of that line, the trip limit is 75 fish. Then, from November 1st through March 31st, north of the Flagler-Volusia County line, the trip limit is 3,500 pounds, and south of that line, there is no trip limit. The first alternative would leave things how they are. The second alternative would be that in the southern zone, the trip limit north of the Flagler-Volusia County line would be 3,500 pounds. And then for the area south of that line, a year-round 75 fish trip limit would be established. For Alternative 3, in the Atlantic Southern Zone, the trip limit north of the Flagler-Volusia County line would be 3,500 pounds. South of that line, we would establish a trip limit of 50 fish from March 1st through March 31st, and then a 75 fish limit for the remainder of the season. There are 2 sub-options here. Option 3A, beginning on August 1st of each season, if 75% of the Season 1 quota has been taken, then the trip limit will be 50 fish. Option 3B, at any time during the season, if 75% of the Season 1 quota has been taken, then the trip limit will be reduced to 50 fish. And then Alternative 4 is a little bit more complicated. So in the southern zone, the trip limit north of that Flagler-Volusia County line would be 3,500 pounds. South of that line, we would establish a trip limit of 50 fish for Season 2. There are a couple sub-options here. Option 4A, for the month of February, if 70% or more of the Season 2 quota is harvested, then the trip limit is 50 fish. And if 70% or less of the Season 2 quota is harvested, the trip limit is 75 fish. Option 4B, from January 1st through the end of February, if 70% or more of the Season 2 quota is harvested, then the trip limit is 50 fish. But if 70% or less of the Season 2 quota is harvested, then the trip limit is 75 fish. And finally, option 4C, for the month of February, if 80% or more of the Season 2 quota is harvested, then the trip limit is 50 fish. If 80% or less of the Season 2 quota is harvested, then the trip limit is 75 fish. Okay, now we get into some Gulf Council stuff. So for Action 6, we address Gulf catch limits. The Gulf Council scientific advisors reviewed the latest stock assessment and have recommended new acceptable biological catch levels. Currently, the Gulf annual catch limit is 10.8 million pounds. This table below shows the newly recommended Gulf acceptable biological catch limits. The first action is the no action alternative, and that would leave the annual catch limit as it is. The second alternative is the Council's current preferred alternative, and that would set the annual catch limit equal to the new acceptable biological catch. Alternative 3 would set a constant catch scenario, and there are two options here. We could set that constant catch either for 3 years or for 5 years. Action 7 addresses Gulf commercial zone quotas. So if the stock boundaries change in Action 1, then the councils will need to reallocate the Gulf Florida East Coast subzones portion of the quota among the 4 remaining fishing components in the Gulf. The first alternative is the no action alternative. The second alternative would revise the zone quotas by dividing the Florida East Coast zone quota into 4 equal parts. Alternative 3 would revise the zone quotas by distributing the Florida East Coast zone quota proportionally to each component's current percent allocation. And then alternative 4 is the Gulf Council's preferred alternative, and that would revise the zone quotas as shown in this table. Action 8 addresses the Gulf sector allocation. So currently the Gulf king mackerel allocation is 68% recreational and 32% commercial. The commercial sector occasionally exceeds their annual catch limit, while the recreational sector lands far less than their share. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative, and that's the Gulf Council's current preferred. Alternative 2 would revise the recreational and commercial allocations for Gulf Migratory Group king mackerel by dividing the stock annual catch limit using one of these options. Option A, 63% to the recreational sector and 37% to the commercial sector. Option B, 58% to the recreational sector and 42% to the commercial sector. And option 3, 48% to the recreational sector and 52% to the commercial sector. Alternative 3 would revise the recreational and commercial allocations for the Gulf Migratory Group king mackerel by transferring a percentage of the stock annual catch limit to the commercial allocation annually until such a time that the recreational sector lands 80% of its allocation, after which no additional allocation would be transferred from the stock annual catch limit to the commercial allocation. So option A would transfer 2% of the stock annual catch limit annually to the commercial allocation, and option B would transfer 5% of that stock annual catch limit annually to the commercial allocation. And then alternative 4 gets a little bit more complicated. Alternative 4 would conditionally transfer a certain percentage, and we'll choose that in options A through D, of the stock annual catch limit to the commercial sector until such a time that the recreational landings reach a predetermined threshold, and we'll address that in options E through G. If the threshold is met, then the recreational and commercial allocations will revert back to the current 68% recreational, 32% commercial. So for the conditional quota transfer, we would have to choose one of the following options: to either transfer 5% of the stock ACL to the commercial sector, 10%, 15%, or 20%. And then for alternative 4, we would also have to choose a recreational annual catch limit threshold. Option E would be to revert to status quo sector allocations if 80% of the adjusted recreational sector annual catch limit is landed. Option F, we would revert back to the status quo if 90% of the adjusted recreational sector annual catch limit is landed. And then option G, we would revert back to status quo if 100% of the adjusted recreational sector annual catch limit is landed. And then finally, alternative 5, establishing a sunset provision for any change in sector allocation for the Gulf migratory king mackerel. After the predetermined time period, any change in sector allocations would revert back to the allocations that are specified currently, which is 68% recreational and 32% commercial. So option A would sunset any change in sector allocations after a 5-year period. Option B would do that after a 10-year period. And option C would do it after a 15-year period. And finally, on to our last action, Action 9, which deals with the Gulf recreational bag limit. So the recreational bag limit is currently 2 fish per person. The recreational sector has never landed its allocation of king mackerel. Increasing the bag limit for the recreational fishery may allow the recreational sector to harvest more fish. 3 simple alternatives here. The first alternative is no action. That would leave the bag limit at 2 fish per person. The current Gulf preferred alternative is alternative 2, and that would increase the bag limit to 3 fish per person in the Gulf. And the South Atlantic's current preferred alternative would increase the bag limit to 4 fish per person in the Gulf. The councils would like to hear your opinions before taking final action on this amendment. You can send us your comment online by following this link. You could also join us on a webinar hearing that we will be hosting at 6 p.m. on March 3rd, and you can register by clicking this button. Or you can simply email us at gulfcouncil@gulfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation and let us know what you think.